Um, Thanks everyone for coming. We're doing a workshop on confronting state repression. My name is James. This is Will. He's co-presenting with me. I've been doing anti-repression and legal support work for political movements, radical movements, for about 7 years now. Houston, Austin, Philly, and now in Colorado. I'm also an attorney. As a quick disclaimer, nothing that I say is legal advice. We're talking about political stuff. Some of the things I say might sound like legal advice. It's actually not. If you have a problem, if you have a specific question, you gotta go hire your attorney. I'm covering my ass. None of it's legal advice. Will can introduce himself.
So I'm definitely not an attorney. My name is Will. I hail from northern Utah. I currently live in Moab. And I've been involved in direct action movements for about a good decade now, and I've kind of seen the ups and downs of repression. I was part of a collective called the Life During Wartime Collective, and we engaged on a research project a couple years ago to try to figure out how social movements respond to repression. And so we solicited contributions from people who were going through repression, both historically and in a contemporary setting. I really tried to figure out, how do our movements get smarter about responding to repression. And so what I'm really interested in is kind of developing popular education and an understanding in our movement about how we deal with repression, both externally and internally. So it's great to be here, and thanks for having us.
Quick roadmap. First 30 minutes or so, we're going to do a very quick, very brief sort of bit about theory, the theory of political repression and the history. Second 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the ways that our movements counteract and resist repression. And then sort of the last 30 minutes will be a bit of a Q&A discussion, probably going a little bit over on the first two sections because we have more material than we can really fit. So I'll let Will start with sort of the core ideas behind the framework that we set up.
So let's start by talking about what is repression. So for the purposes of this workshop, we'll define repression as the means in which a state uses to protect itself from political challenges. And I really want to kind of destabilize the idea of politics as something that just happens in the state or something that happens in a ballot box. Politics is something, it's power. It's how power is managed, contested, challenged. And so when we talk about political challenges, we're not just talking about unseating some representative official with another. Politics happens in the streets, it happens in our homes, it happens everywhere around us. But repression is the means that a state uses to protect its authority, right? Its legitimacy. And that legitimacy, I think, is really important because that, in theory, comes from us. It's something that we give to the state or we give to hierarchical structures. And that's always unstable. It's never given, and I think that that's one important part about understanding the theory of repression is that the state's existence is tentative. It depends on people giving that legitimacy to them. And important for this, repression can be a response to crisis, such as uprisings or civil wars, what have you, but it's also the method of preserving normalcy. So repression is something that happens every day. And it is not always the coercive part about it, although that's kind of, the riot cops with nightsticks kicking down doors sort of thing is what we often think of repression. But we really want to challenge ourselves to think about repression as both coercive and productive. Productive in the sense of producing obedient citizens, obedient subjects, that sort of thing. And political repression is constant and continuing. It's always adapting and reacting to movements for emancipatory change. The methods and degree of repression might vary depending on the intensity of social movement challenges to state authority. And also when we use the word state here, I really want to add corporate and corporate state authority or colonial authority because historically a lot of the techniques for political repression come from colonization. They also come in a context where corporate power is sometimes as strong or stronger than state power, but there's a continuity in terms of the methods used in repression. So when we say the state, I'm actually kind of talking about governing structures in general, colonial, corporate, or state. The vitality and effectiveness of movements depend not on its ability to avoid repression. We think this is kind of a virtual impossibility given our current political context because repression always exists. It exists when the NSA reads your Facebook feed. It exists when it co-ops movement leadership. And so it's not whether we can avoid oppression or not, but it's really how we constitute our strategic approach to that. And so the last core idea that we want to communicate is that the ways we resist repression have less to do with how we think and conduct ourselves in relationship to the state or power structures, and more about how we conduct our relationships and practices with each other.
So if we're thinking about the ways that repression works on social movements, it's sort of important to think about how social movements work, sort of the internal dynamics and what they're trying to do. And I stole this sort of 6-point framework out of a book and kind of adapted it. And it's not perfect, but I think it helps us think about the specific things that social movements are trying to do, and which can lead us to thinking about how state repression works on social movements. So the first thing is maintaining solidarity and morale and commitment amongst current members and organizations. The people, the groups that are participating in these social movements, keeping them invested, keeping them energized, keeping them working together instead of fighting with each other, instead of feeling really despondent and depressed and hopeless, basically keeping that energy going towards building the world that we want to see, contesting the power structures that we want to contest. Second, attracting new recruits, creating new alliances with community organizations. This is building the broader base of the movement. Obviously, if it's just the 12 of us in the social movement, we can have some limited impact, but it would be a bigger impact if we could, bring in a few more people, or if we could work together with another organization that's already in existence. So building those bonds, increasing our base of support. Number 3, creating, nurturing, and supporting leadership or empowerment. Basically, improving the capacity of the movement. Giving people new skills, whether it's, skills for direct action, skills for media work, skills for, internal conflict mediation. All the skills that go into building a social movement, a transformative movement that's both internally and externally egalitarian. Number 4, generating favorable media coverage. This is how one of the ways that movements communicate with the broader public is through the media. And so being able to interface with the media, especially on a favorable way, so that the media refers to you as agents of social change rather than agitators and terrorists. Number 5, mobilizing support from sympathetic bystanders. The whole population isn't always, most of them aren't going to be directly involved in protesting in the streets, walking down, to stop some project. But maybe, sympathetic people in the public that aren't willing to take that commitment might still be willing to contribute to your bail fund or help you raise money for a particular project or something. And so being able to mobilize that support from the broader base in the community. And then number 6, carving out the tactical freedom to pursue the movement's goals, rather than spending a lot of time on legal defense and bailing people out of jail and working on these legal cases, or a lot of time infighting with each other. Actually moving forward to contest the things that you're trying to contest, to build the things that you're trying to build. There's this idea that in a political conflict, there's an advantage that accrues not to necessarily the person with the most resources or the movement with the most resources, but the movement that can create and maintain the initiative, the one that has the energy and the momentum behind it. And so being able to continue that momentum and that energy rather than being in a purely reactive and defensive posture when undergoing repression is also extremely important.
So a little maxim that we like to give out is that the antidote to repression is more resistance. And by this we don't just mean an escalation of militancy and tactics. What we mean is a broadening and a deepening of our base of support. Insurgencies are contestations over legitimacy. So when you have an insurgent social movement, they're contesting legitimacy of the state, corporate power structure, social hierarchy, what have you. And what we've seen is successful insurgent movements are ones that develop broad bases of legitimacy in their communities that give them both strategic and tactical advantages to basically outwit and outmaneuver their enemies. And I also just really want us to think about this not just in terms of a dichotomy, not just in terms of like two different sides, because oftentimes, especially in our current context, we see there are many different poles in insurgent situations. Like if we think about what's happening in Rojava right now, for example, you have anarchist-inspired Kurdish militias who are fighting both against the Turkish state, but also against ISIS, also against other militias that might not have their same interests. And so when we think about these sort of things, it's definitely not a like black and white sort of conflicts. There are oftentimes many different actors in that. But the thing that all those actors are competing over and working around is that popular legitimacy from below, right? And I think that this is something that radicals in the United States could really learn to use. And I say that as someone who's been in these movements and seen these failures and kind of reproduce these failures, where a lot of times the ideas that we have are that we have an analysis that's maybe more moral or more ethical or more right than the others. And that is not, and that's maybe true, but that is not enough for us to actually win in the very real conflicts that we find ourselves in. We need popular support to be able to carry out the tactics that we need to carry out, to do the things that we need to do. And so when we talk about deepening resistance, that's what we're talking about. So there's kind of four broad categories when we're talking about the tactics of repression. And one thing that we're trying to do here is kind of come up with a basic curriculum. So what we would like this to become and to emerge in the future is that y'all can take these ideas and this curriculum and basically be able to teach this in your own community and adapt it to whatever context that you're working within. And so that's why some of this stuff might be a little 101. And so if you're like, yeah, I know this sort of thing, like think about how you can take these ideas and adapt them to your situation, because what we would like to come out of this are kind of a multitude of people that can teach these sort of ideas in their own communities. So these four broad categories, one is kind of the most kind of easy to think about, which is the physical violence. And this is the state and corporate colonial patriarchal actors physically intimidating activists and potential participants, inflicting trauma and physical toll, creating fear, and eliminating specific activists. You know, there's clear examples that come to mind. You know, the assassination of Fred Hampton in Chicago by the Chicago police, or the bombing of Judy Berry, or the imprisonment of Chelsea Manning. You know, these sort of things where we can really think about the the attack on specific activists and that sort of thing, or riot cops kicking down doors in the night, that sort of thing. So that's one category. The second category is legal, and this is basically everything that happens through the court. This is strategic lawsuits against public participation, trumped up charges, terrorism charges, this sort of thing. And when we're thinking about long-term social and political conflicts, the legal ramifications of these sort of things are often that it slows down movements, it takes resources, people are spending time in court and kind of acting on a defensive posture. And so a lot of the legal strategies that we've seen have that explicitly in mind. So for example, I was involved in the campaign against the Keystone XL pipeline, and one thing we saw a lot is that TransCanada, which was the oil pipeline company, would go to the rural sheriffs and basically present them with a list of potential charges to file against activists. So they did all the legal work beforehand and saying this is what you should charge them with, and what they knew is that they probably wouldn't get those charges to stick ultimately, but if the local sheriffs were giving out these charges to activists, then the activists would be stuck in court fighting these charges and wouldn't be able to keep the momentum going forward. And so legal defense is a really important part of resisting repression, but it's not the only part. It's actually just one of four different categories. The next is surveillance and disruption. This is creating fear, paranoia, distrust, confusion. This consumes our energy and resources within fighting, and it robs the initiative. Now, with the Snowden leaks, with the revelations about the NSA, we're really understanding the scope of surveillance that exists now, but that's something that resistance movements have always had to face, is snitches from within the movement, or infiltrators and that sort of thing. And it's something that until we ultimately do away with the hierarchical structures that we're trying to fight, we're always going to have to deal with this in some sense. But the real important point about the category of surveillance and disruption is that it's thinking about the capacity drain that it has, right? We're always, as anarchists, as people in resistance movements, we're kind of always going to be under surveillance, but that doesn't mean that we can still take effective action and build effective movements even while we're under that. And so with all these categories, it's a matter of figuring out how we can operate most efficiently and effectively given that. And the last is media. And this is where, in the media, they're calling us terrorists and agitators and all that nonsense. This is something in our current context, media has very real ramifications, and the media conflict is sometimes just as or more important than conflicts in the street, because it's a battle over the narrative, it's a battle over the story, and who wins that oftentimes directly influences where that popular legitimacy lies. So those are the four main categories: physical violence, legal, surveillance, and media. Oh, that's me. Okay, so chronology of repression. So let me just be really honest that we're not going to be able to cover everything here. There are a lot of good books and amazing research that has gone on about this, and so if we're missing something, it's not because we don't value it, it's just because we don't have the time to talk about it. So I think it's really important to understand the colonial background of repression, because a lot of the tactics that we see come from the colonial era. So for, just to give you an example that sticks out in my mind, the Mau Mau Rebellion was an anti-colonial rebellion in the area now known as Kenya, and a lot of the British approaches to that was coming up with these gang units, and basically categorizing this resistance movement as gangs and thinking about it in terms of gang warfare. Now that's something that, like, when we think about our current context and people who have been left out of the equation in our current world oftentimes are described as gangs or bandits or that sort of thing. And so a lot of the terminology is the same, but also a lot of the broad strategy is the same. Divide and conquer, being one of the most basic, offering some benefits to some members of movements and then denying others and trying to split and that sort of thing. So understanding the colonial background of this is really important, not just because that's our history and where it comes from, but we can also see strategic parallels. A lot of the underlying power dynamics are really similar. And there's a racialized aspect here that is really important to acknowledge and talk about, because communities of color oftentimes experience swifter, more ruthless, and more violent repression. And that's really real, and we always need to talk about that because it's reality. So we're going to skip through about 150 years here really quick. Bear with us as we do it. And the reason that we're just citing these sort of things is really so y'all can go do your own research about this and reading, but we just want to highlight some instances of repression that we think kind of define where strategies of repression have changed over the years. And that's really kind of the core takeaway that we want you to have with this, is how has repression changed over this 150-year history?
So that 150-year history, I'm going to do it in 3 seconds. There's been political repression taking place against dissident social movements in the U.S. since the U.S. was created. Probably even before that, Alien Sedition Acts back in the early 1800s, repression against the labor movement in the late 1800s, the Red Scares from the 19-teens through the 1950s, all of that political repression. I think that the 1950s really ushered in sort of what I consider sort of the modern era of repression, something a little bit more sophisticated and in some ways more insidious. Our movements often talk about COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO is sort of an abbreviation for the Counterintelligence Program, which was a secret campaign of political repression that the FBI orchestrated from 1956 to 1971 under J. Edgar Hoover. And the stated purpose of COINTELPRO was to protect national security, prevent violence, and most importantly, maintain the existing social and political order, maintain those existing hierarchies of power, the existing hierarchies of race, class, gender. 1956 was really the height of Jim Crow segregation. These were the hierarchies that COINTELPRO sought to maintain. It did this by targeting certain groups to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize them as effective movements for change that sought to prevent the coalition of groups from working together. It sought to prevent the rise of sort of a messianic figure that could unite people or be a leading figurehead. At various times, people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King were both seen as potentially messianic figures for the Black liberation movement, and were targeted with very specific repression. Preventing violence, preventing these groups from gaining respectability in the larger community, the larger nation, and preventing the long-range growth of these organizations. COINTELPRO specifically targeted civil rights groups, Black Power, Black liberation groups, the anti-war movement in particular, as well as Native American, Chicano Power, other liberation groups that grew at that time. And I think COINTELPRO was, sort of a nadir of this, current political repression. It was sort of unusual in how explicit it was in we're going to use whatever insidious means possible to neutralize and eliminate these groups. And so, the FBI began as a very political organization. It grew out of the Pinkerton investigation group that was created to destroy the labor movement. From its very beginning, it was a political law enforcement organization. I could talk for 3 hours about COINTELPRO, and Will's going to get mad at me if I do that. But I do want to give one example, focusing on the Chicago Black Panther Party, about this sort of all-directional, concerted effort to destroy the Chicago Black Panther Party in the late 1960s. The leader of the party at that time was Fred Hampton. He was 20, 21 years old, rising in the Black Panther leadership. Very articulate. His orating skills were compared to Dr. King. He was, very charismatic, and he was also doing some remarkable organizing, building coalition amongst apolitical street gangs in Chicago to build a more unified political force amongst the downtrodden and oppressed. And so trying to get these gangs to turn away from sort of antisocial crime to more explicitly political and revolutionary actions. In response to this, there's all manner of repression targeted against Hampton and the Chicago Panthers. They would, arrest members on sort of really petty things, but arrest them over and over again until they couldn't afford bail, or just really disrupt their daily activities. They would send false letters between the Black Panther leadership and the leadership of some of these other groups that they were working with, saying that there's supposed to be a hit out for you, or I heard that somebody in our organization is looking to get you out of the way. And so creating a lot of fear and distrust. How can you organize a coalition with this group if you're getting letters that are supposed to be from that group saying that they're looking to kill you? And so creating a lot of division there. They infiltrated the inner circle of the Panther leadership in Chicago. The infiltrator, whose last name was O'Neill, he would go in and start accusing other people of being infiltrators. Like, you're an infiltrator, you're an infiltrator. And then he would propose these really fantastical, ridiculous things like building a homemade electric chair to torture the people that he was accusing of being infiltrators. And he was the infiltrator. Ultimately, he provided the FBI and the Chicago police with a hand-drawn map of Fred Hampton's apartment that the Chicago police used when they raided Fred Hampton's house, and basically fired 100 bullets into, focused on where the informant had drawn Fred Hampton's bed. Fred Hampton was asleep. Another Panther, Mark Clark, was also sleeping in a chair. Both of them were shot and killed that night in what's pretty clear assassination. To eliminate this prominent figure and to destroy the local chapter of the Black Panther Party. COINTELPRO officially ended in 1971. Some people broke into an FBI field office in Pennsylvania, stole a shitload of records, walked out with them, and then published them. And that was the first that anybody in America besides the FBI knew about COINTELPRO. And there were, all these Senate hearings, like, the Senate was outraged because they're like, the FBI is clearly breaking the law on all sorts of levels here. But even though COINTELPRO officially ended in 1971, the tactics and the strategies that COINTELPRO developed continued on against the American Indian movement, the Chicano, Puerto Rican independence movements, black liberation groups, queer and women's liberation groups, and then in the 80s, Central American solidarity groups, anti-apartheid movements, anti-nuclear movements. All these movements were targeted with very similar tactics to what took place under COINTELPRO. It was just they didn't have the cool name COINTELPRO for it anymore.
So I think one thing that's important about understanding this history of COINTELPRO is the continuity between COINTELPRO and today. So just sometimes that's an actual person. One of the people who was involved in the Hampton issue and a lot of others would go on to be involved in the Judy Berry bombing that affected our first organizing during Redwood Summers. And so sometimes there's individuals who you can actually see this continuity. This is true in counterinsurgency efforts. You see these advisors, advising the RAND Corporation or the U.S. military or kind of proxy militaries around the world. And then other times there are strategic parallels between COINTELPRO and today. But the state and corporate repressive structures and strategies change and adapt to how our movements have changed and adapt. And I think that's a really important concept to take forward, is that in the same way that our movements have changed and adapts, no longer, do we think of, we got to build a people's army to take over the state and, institute our socialist communist utopia. The state has also changed and adapted, and oftentimes does that in very explicit reading of our own material. And so there's this dialectic that we see back and forth, and I think the implication of that is that there's a real responsibility for participants in social movements to read and have a very good understanding of how the state plans to engage and repress social movements, because our adaptations kind of need to stay ahead. We need to be smarter than the state and corporate repressive structures. A really good example of the changes that we're starting to see kind of come about during what's called the anti-globalization era. This is kind of 1990s, early 2000s. Just to give a little context of this, there was this thing called the Washington Consensus, this idea that free trade would usher in democracy all around the world, and there were these transnational institutions like the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank who were kind of carrying these things forward, and they faced resistance all over the world, from the Zapatistas to anti-globalization activists here in the States. And oftentimes this would kind of come down in these very spectacular protests that would happen at these conventions. The Battle of Seattle kind of is one of the most notorious, where the World Trade Organization was trying to host this big summit in Seattle, and everyone from labor movements to feminist environmental groups to black bloc anarchists shut down Seattle and prevented these things from going forward by using really innovative and interventionary tactics to shut the city down and prevent these things from happening. And the repressive institutions were like, whoa, 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 we really need to, this is like something we haven't faced before, we need to kind of up our game. And so what they kind of came out of that period is what is called the Miami model. And there's a pretty good film by Crime Thing called The Miami Model that is another good resource that you can check out to learn more about this. So the Miami model was defined by a joint unified multi-agency command structure that existed before the demonstration, that did a lot of media work beforehand to kind of frame the conflict that was happening. These media frames that sound very normal and natural kind of came out of the violent protesters and anarchists versus the well-trained police, terrorist targets, and the police protecting our right to protest. These are terms that kind of came out of this era. Eco-terrorism as a term also kind of came out of this era. The Miami model was defined by these mass purchases of surveillance equipment, riot gear, weaponry, just like millions of dollars, $8 million for Miami, $50 million for the subsequent Republican National Convention in St. Paul. Previous theories of crowd control and riot control, you can kind of see three distinct periods of this. One was escalated force. This was really prevalent during the civil rights movement, and that is where they would just escalate their amount of violence and force based on how rowdy things got in the street. During kind of anti-globalization years, what was a big part of this is this negotiated management. So they would come in beforehand and contact protest organizers and say, well, we know there's going to be a protest and we want to protect your right to protest, so we've created this little protest pen over here, this little box surrounded by chain link fence, and you're allowed to protest in here. What we need your help with is preventing these potential terrorist anarchists from shutting down this thing. And so you tell us who are the troublemakers, tell us their plans, and so they try to negotiate this management with that. And I think much to the benefit of a lot of movement actors at the time is people understood that negotiated management didn't do anything to build the credibility of movement and didn't do anything to advance our tactical or strategic advantages. And so that refusal to negotiate with the police and cooperate that kind of led to the collapse of that sort of model. What we really saw kind of coming out of that is this idea of strategic incapacitation. And we really saw this present during the Occupy years, and even previous to Occupy during some of the kind of convention protests where the emphasis was on preemptively preventing big manifestations from happening. So raiding houses and convention centers, nabbing people on potential terrorist charges beforehand, really trying to prevent the movement from building a capacity to act in the street. And so there's certainly a mix of these sort of styles. Sometimes you get a little negotiated management, sometimes you get a little strategic incapacitation. But when you're planning big actions, whether it's whatever campaigns you're working on, be wary of these sort of things. And this is why it's really important to understand these theories and tactics of repression, because you will likely encounter them at some point. So I skipped over kind of war on terror years and green scare years, which James can cover.
Yeah, so most of y'all seem to be about my age, give or take. And so I know it's hard for me to remember a time before the War on Terror, a time before 2001. But it's important to remember that a lot of the facets of the War on Terror that sort of seem almost natural and inevitable to us today didn't always exist. After September 11th, there was a much more concerted effort of targeting Muslims, people of Arab, Middle Eastern descent, South Asian, North African descent, infiltrating mosques and religious communities, trying to suss out the idea that there's these radical Islamists hiding out in America. There's the extraordinary legal proceedings that took place with the War on Terror, the denial of due process, indefinite detention of enemy combatants and suspected terrorists, not giving suspected terrorists access to the courts or to attorneys, no public trials, just locking them up indefinitely at Guantanamo Bay or some CIA black site overseas. A lot of more preemptive sort of sting operations by the FBI and other law enforcement, where FBI will sort of troll internet message boards and internet forums and stuff, and find somebody that's talking some radical stuff on there, and then they'll start talking with the guy, and so here you have some isolated, sort of confused, maybe misdirected, usually sort of young, marginal person that they get these FBI people to pretend that they're like the big terrorist organization and get this kid to think that he's participating in some big terrorist conspiracy. And so the FBI sort of constructs this terrorist conspiracy, leads this kid along the entire way, and then, just before it's about to go off, the FBI swoops in and they're like, hey guys, we saved all of America from this dangerous terrorist that was talking some shit on the internet, and we constructed a conspiracy to save you from. There was never any conspiracy to begin with until the FBI created it, but they're creating the threat and then saving you from it to ramp up the paranoia and also build up their own legitimacy. Another thing was sort of the large-scale mapping of communities that are identified racially and religiously primarily. The NYPD had this demographics unit, and their whole purpose was to map the social geography of Muslim communities in the New York area. To, through some data analysis, try to identify people that they thought would be more likely to radicalize or more likely to commit terrorist acts or something. And sort of this hyper-technical idea that you can predict terrorism or predict radicalization and preemptively stop people that gets, in a lot of ways, dangerously close to like punishing and prosecuting thought crimes, punishing people's ideas or opinions. In addition, sort of, back in the, during the Cold War, any political opponent that the U.S. had, the insult of choice was to call him a communist or a communist sympathizer or some sort of socialist. That's really flipped, and now the insult of choice is terrorist. So you get anarchists become terrorists, environmental activists become terrorists, anti-police brutality activists becoming terrorists. Not becoming terrorists, but being called terrorists. And sort of this larger narrative being constructed about all opposition, all protest is somehow linked to terrorism. And so anti-terrorism resources being devoted to policing dissent and political action in the United States was very much a product of the war on terror. Additionally, there's been one of the outgrowths of the larger war on terror is what's called the Green Scare, which is a term that sort of connects the hysteria and repression of the environmental and animal rights movements to the Red Scare of yesteryear, of the repression of communist, socialist, leftist movements. And sort of constructing this idea of eco-terrorism, where somebody that burns down a development is the eco-terrorist, but the company that clear cuts a forest, pollutes all your rivers, strip mines your mountains, aren't the eco-terrorists. It's just the person that did some property damage over here. And then constructing that, calling that the #1 domestic terrorist threat in the country, where you've got right-wing abortion clinic bombers that blow up Oklahoma City, assassinate police officers, kill doctors. That's not the #1 terrorist threat. It's these hippies that broke some windows and burned down a couple buildings. Those are the #1 domestic terrorist threat. So creating this narrative, infiltrating environmental movements. Two of the biggest examples, one was Operation Backfire in 2005. There were some Earth Liberation Front and Animal Liberation Front arsons across the western U.S. that had been unsolved for 5 or 10 years. And the government got a lead on this one guy, Jake Ferguson. And Jake Ferguson had kind of a sketchy past. He had a heroin addiction. He had been sort of removed. He was sort of removed from activist communities at that point and had a falling out with his former comrades. And FBI sort of leaned on him and put a lot of pressure on him and used those vulnerabilities. And he ended up wearing a wire, traveling around the country at the FBI's expense, and meeting with all of his former best friends to talk about, have a little nostalgia trip about these things that they did while recording it, and then, using that to prosecute people. And so this whole sort of former network of people that had been really tight with each other, that over the years had sort of gone their separate ways, a lot of interpersonal conflicts. Some of these people didn't really like each other anymore. And so a lot of these people that got busted ended up turning evidence on their other friends. And so sort of this cascade effect where, they lean on one person who gets all this evidence on everybody, and then each person starts falling and pointing fingers at each other. There were a few people that, resisted that and refused to turn evidence on, even people that they hated now, that were turning evidence on them, but still had some manner of integrity. Were like, I'm not going to, regardless of what they're saying, I'm not going to give evidence on them. One of the things there was that, the FBI, it was like, 2005, the FBI was still relying on a lot of the really old-fashioned investigative techniques. sometimes we get really wrapped up in the sort of high-tech stuff about the NSA reading our Facebook or our text messages or whatever. But what blew this case open wasn't Facebook messages, wasn't wiretaps, wasn't internet searches. It was, you know, the police leaning on one guy until he turned evidence on all of his friends. And so sometimes we get so wrapped up in sort of the technological aspects of surveillance and repression that we forget about, you know, all the social and interpersonal aspects of it. The other example, the case of Eric McDavid, this was another situation where, you know, the FBI sort of constructs a terrorist plot using one of their informants, and then, you know, drags some young, sort of inexperienced, sort of impressionable kids down this path until they can then bust the conspiracy that they created. In this case, the informant, who went by the name Anna Davies, really exploited Eric's sort of romantic interest in her, and sort of really put a lot of pressure on this group of 3 other people, you know, bringing them out to California, paying all their expenses, sort of yelling at them, coercing them when they were trying to, like, you know, nobody seemed interested in this sort of like terrorist conspiracy, and she's like, I thought y'all were committed, we gotta have a plan, and sort of just dragging them tooth and nail down this path until they got arrested. Eric got sentenced to 22 years in prison after losing a trial with an entrapment defense. But he was actually released last year after only 8 or 9 years because it came out that the government had actually suppressed and hidden evidence of Anna Davies exploiting and coercing and manipulating Eric that would have been hugely beneficial to an entrapment defense, like love letters between the two that the government had then hidden from his defense attorneys. And so this whole, you know, cover-up sort of blew up, and they let Eric out of prison early, thank God, after only spending 9 years in prison. Only 9, no big deal. So that's sort of the Green Scare war on terrorism aspect that, you know, sometimes we really just sort of take for granted and assume is inevitable, but isn't always. Do you have more to say about that?
Sure. So sometimes when we talk about these things, like, we keep bouncing between these highly personalized stories, whether it's like Fred Hampton, Eric McDavid, and then kind of like bouncing back to the larger strategic picture. And I think that's really important because our own personal lives are oftentimes enmeshed in this work. Like, we don't do this as professionals, or this isn't like a job that like you're able to clock out of at the end of the day. This is like a life in resistance movements. And the difficulty in that is that those consequences oftentimes follow years later, as the Jacob Ferguson example really talks about. And so I think the important implication of that is that our ethics and morals and integrity around being involved in anarchist movements or resistance movements can't just end when we're like no longer into it anymore. This is a lifetime of commitment. And I think the really important thing, and a thing that we can really see from studying successful resistance movements, specifically intergenerational resistance movements, is that this is a way of life. It's a form of life, of antagonism against the state, against hierarchical social structures, that I would really encourage you to think about how do you set up your life to not only maintain that integrity for your ideas and ideals, but really for the safety and well-being of your community. And I think that that's a really important point to think about, is that this isn't just something that we're encouraging you to study as an individual, but to really spread throughout your community and develop a community of practice about how do we understand engaging in this resistance work over long periods of time, so that we keep not only ourselves and our cameras, but, you know, future generations healthy and safe and living in a world that's worth living in. And also the implication of that is that, you know, we do this work not just because we want to resist repression, but because we want to build an emancipatory world, right? A world that is less dependent on ecocide and enslavement and oppression, but one that is actually a lot better. So to do that, understanding our history, you know, allows us to move forward. You know, Shakespeare said, "What's past is prologue." And so thinking about not only these individual cases, but also kind of the larger picture is an important part about that. And just a quick note about kind of Occupy years and all of that, is that we see these changes in repression. COINTELPRO no longer exists as that program anymore, but there are still agencies out there that practice COINTELPRO-like tactics. And when COINTELPRO-like tactics no longer do the trick, there are other tactics that are going to work. And a lot of these are they're not like a secret conspiracy. Like there's that awesome example of actors breaking into the office and like stealing the COINTELPRO documents, right? There's Chelsea Manning leaking that sort of stuff. There's Edward Snowden examples, but a lot of this stuff is at kind of face value surface. Like a lot of the research I did in the counterinsurgency, I just went and talked to the people that were doing that and wrote them emails, and they very freely kind of gave that information out, almost kind of gloatingly. And I think the implication of that is that we can do this research ourselves, and what we're telling you right here, kind of the best, to the best of our knowledge right now, but I would really encourage all y'all to kind of do your own research and continue researching your local police department, your local, who you're up against. So for example, in Utah, I'm a part of a campaign that's fighting a tar sands mine, right? And we do our own research into who we're up against. So we have a private security company that's recently been hired to do research on us, and we do research on them. And there is kind of a bit of a cat and mouse thing that goes on, but there are also these kind of large patterns that I think are really important to identify. So within Occupy, we talked about negotiated management turning into strategic incapacitation. And another kind of term that I want to throw in there is the idea of the Duchin formula. This comes from Stratfor. Stratfor is kind of called the private CIA. They're an intelligence and analysis company based in Texas. And part of the leaks that Jeremy Hammond released, who was an anonymous hacker, was a series of PowerPoint presentations that came out of Stratfor. Duchin, who the idea of the Duchin strategy comes from, was one of the old founders of Stratfor. And in this PowerPoint that Hammond leaked was an analysis that they gave to tar sands companies before a lot of the campaigns against Keystone and those sort of things kind of came online. And what you see in this PowerPoint is that they say divide these groups into radicals, idealists, pragmatists, and opportunists, right? And each one of those, when you kind of divide them up, you can then kind of divide and conquer and play to those specific interests. So you isolate the radicals, you appease the realists, you give the opportunists some opportunity, and the realists, you assure them that small pragmatic changes will happen, that sort of thing. And so why it's important to understand things like the Duchin formula or negotiated management and strategic incapacitation is that what we were talking about at the beginning is that this is less how we relate to Stratfor and their strategies, like we should rest until Stratfor is a pile of ashes, but we're not going to be able to do that until we figure out how within our movements we calibrate our strategies effectively. So what this means is that when we understand things like the Duchin formula, then the implication is, oh right, we can't let big greens go to the negotiating table and try to sell out our rainforests or tar sands mines and that sort of stuff and be able to isolate the radicals. We need to build coalitions that are able to hold each other accountable on both sides so that we can't get sold out, so that we can't be divided and conquered and that sort of thing. And so that is kind of the transition we're going to go to now, is talk about how we protect our movements from political repression. And James came up with a really great 5 S's and an O. So
we're going to switch gears here. Everybody should sort of shift in their seat so you're putting your weight on the other side now, because it's sort of mental adjustment here. Because if you didn't, I know some of y'all were sort of dozing off for a minute there, but this is the important shit. So, a lot of these things on repression sort of put a lot of doom and gloom into people's minds, and you're like, man, repression sucks, the state's terrible, everything's terrible. So now we want to get psyched about fighting back against repression. And so I came up with this sort of arbitrary framework. I call it 5 S's and an O because I've learned something somewhere that people remember things better that way. The first S, solidarity and support for the people and organizations that are being targeted. When a particular person, a particular group is facing repression, whether it's getting kicked by cops in the street, whether it's getting arrested and prosecuted, whether it's agents coming, knocking, and asking questions, houses being raided, press releases to the media about how some group is terrible, and agitating and terrorizing and blah, blah, blah. We need to step up immediately to support those people and those organizations. The power of the state is incredible. You know, the United States government won 2 world wars. So the state against one person or one affinity group or one collective is immense, and so we got to have their back. Ask the people that are being targeted, what do they need? Do you need legal support? Do you need money to raise bail? Do you need somebody to just come over and help you process this stuff because it's really traumatizing? You know, if you're the one that's facing repression, if you've got agents coming to talk to you, if you've been arrested for something political, you need to speak up about what you need. We all need stuff. We all need support. And being super macho and being like, nah, I got this, that's not helpful. We got to have each other's backs. We got to face this stuff together. And if we let each other get isolated, if we let each other go it alone, then we're sunk. We're way past sunk. Fight back against the state's tactics to divide us. One of the things they use is the distinction between good protesters and bad protesters, or peaceful protesters and nonviolent protesters. The local community members or the outside agitators. Outside agitators is one of those things that people have been saying since slavery, where slave masters were like, oh, my slaves are happy, they're content, they like it. It's these outside agitators that are stirring things up. Again, in the union movement, our workers are happy, they're content. It's these outside agitators that are coming in. That's bullshit. And so this idea that there's some special local group of community people that aren't outside agitators is nonsense, and we need to fight against that distinction. The same with the distinction between violent and nonviolent. That's one of the ones they love to use, is to get us wrapped up in this discussion and this argument about violence, and get the nonviolent ones to point out the violent ones, and have us pointing fingers at each other that the state can use to oh, we know we can, beat that guy up and arrest him and do whatever we want to him because all these other people are so scared because we called him violent and we don't want to be associated with that guy. When somebody's being targeted like that, we got to be like, nah, he's one of us. We got his back. Building, especially in legal cases, building support that's not based on any ideas of innocence. A lot of the work that we do runs in conflict with the law, whether it's having an unpermitted march, whether it's having a blockade, whether it's breaking a window, all these things. And so if we're basing our support on the idea that somebody's innocent, then if they get found guilty at trial, or if they accept a guilty plea, then what happens to our support? It breaks apart. We want to support people because they're doing good work to help build the world that we want to see, the world against racism, patriarchy, all the forms of oppression, build the world of justice and liberation that we're looking to see. That's why we want to be supporting these people. Political repression is a form of trauma. People that have undergone repression often show a lot of signs of sort of post-traumatic stress. And so it's important to offer emotional support to counteract that. You'll see that, people finish up their court case after an action or something, and then they start drifting off. And we want to be checking in, are you okay? What do you need? Because that's how movements fall apart. You get past the big thing, and then you sort of all dribble away. Building support for political prisoners, grand jury resistors, people that face incarceration because of their political actions. If we don't step up and support those people, then what's going to happen the next time somebody's like, I could go to that blockade, but the last guys that did a blockade, nobody gave a shit, and so I don't want to be in that position. Versus, oh, the last people that did it, yeah, they got in trouble, yeah, it was tough, but people had their back. And, this is scary, this is intense, I'm not sure if I want to do it, but, I know that whatever happens, people are going to have my back. That's what we want people to remember. proactively building relationships with allies. You know, we can't, sometimes we get stuck in like being more radical than other people, or like, you know, we can't work with liberals because they're just going to blah, blah, blah. If you build a relationship with them, if you build trust with them, then you can have a relationship, an alliance that's, you know, built on solidarity and not worry about getting sold out at the end. One of the really good examples of this was at the Republican convention in St. Paul in 2008, that in the lead up to the convention, they had built a widespread coalition with, like, you know, super liberal groups and super anarchist groups and basically everything in between. But they built their coalition explicitly around the idea that we're not going to sell each other out, we're not going to cooperate and collaborate with law enforcement against each other, that we're going to have each other's backs. And so if we build our alliances on those terms, then, you know, then we have something explicit that we can move forward from. But if we think that we can go it alone, that our little anarchist clique or our little communist clique or whatever can fight these fights on our own, we're going to find ourselves, you know, pushed out and crushed really easily. And then another piece is connecting the sort of overtly political repression to the larger picture, the larger apparatus of repressive policing. That, you know, there's all these things, like Will was talking about, sort of anti-gang units and anti-gang policing that sort of has crossover with how police target political movements. The, you know, the same way that they profile gang members is sort of also the same way that they profile political radicals. Oh, what kind of tattoos do you have? Oh, you're wearing those black Carhartts, you must be with that group. And so sort of pushing back against, you know, this, you know, stuff against, you know, gang units and stuff that also, you know, builds alliances between, you know, our explicitly political movements and the more tacitly political, like, anti-gang stuff, and being able to build those alliances. Also, you know, resisting border security and border militarization. You know, working with Muslim communities that are being targeted in the war on terror, not so much for explicitly political action, but just because of their religious belief systems. That, you know, if the war on terror is coming down on them, definitely a lot harder than it's coming down on us, you know, we're a lot better together than we are separated. So, first S, solidarity and support for the people and groups that are being targeted. Always and forever. We got to have each other's backs. We want people to have our backs. One quick example, there was a period in Austin when I was living there where our community was facing pretty significant repression, and, you know, the FBI was coming around to people's houses, and I had a friend of mine come up to me, you know, after one of these rounds, and he's like, "Hey man, do you mind if you, like, just take my phone number out of your phone?" And to me, this is like stab in the back, because, you know, here we are facing all this repression, you know, being threatened with, you know, criminal charges, grand jury investigations, all this stuff. I want people to be like, "Yeah, man, we got you." And this guy's like, "Yo, I want to be, like, further from you. I don't want my number in your phone." That made me feel really bad. And so you think about, you know, when you find out that somebody that you know, somebody in your community is being targeted, think about how you interact with them. Is your first response like, "Whoa," or is your first response, "Come here, man, we got you"? That's what we want to be thinking about. That's what we want to be doing. Number 2, silence to law enforcement. Non-cooperation with law enforcement has to be sort of a baseline expectation in our movements. Part of the purpose of the history aspect of this is to show the continuity between different periods of repression, to show that it's sort of an ongoing presence, and that the role of law enforcement in this country and in society is one of maintaining the current social and political hierarchies. If you think about any social movement, any movement for justice that you can think of, the police have always been on the wrong side. Whether they're shooting strikers outside of a mine back in the 1920s, whether they're hosing and beating civil rights protesters in the 1950s, whether they're tear gassing anti-war protesters, tear gassing and beating anti-globalization protesters, you know, when was the last time that the police are like, "Yeah, we're going to help with this blockade"? It doesn't happen. And so realizing that the police exist to maintain the status quo that we're trying to change. So talking to law enforcement, always a bad idea. You always have the right to refuse to answer questions. The only thing you need to say is, I'm going to remain silent. I want to speak to an attorney. I do not consent to a search. You don't have to worry about whether or not the police have the right to be searching your house or your stuff or anything. Just say you don't consent. Say that you're going to remain silent. It doesn't matter if they say, oh, your friends already told us everything. They pin it all on you. It's going to be bad if you don't talk to us. Or, oh, we can go work out a deal with the DA if you just come clean. There's all sorts of tactics that the police will use to get you to talk, to get you to incriminate yourself. Everything that you say can and will be used against you. It'll be sort of twisted around and taken out of context and used against you. Nothing that you say to law enforcement can help you. There's actually rules of evidence that say if you say 100 things to law enforcement that are good for you and one thing that's bad for you, the only thing that can come in at trial is the one thing that's bad for you. A little bit bananas, but it's true. Nothing that you say to law enforcement can help you. You can't explain your way out of a situation. Doesn't matter how friendly or how cooperative or whatever they're trying to be. Anything that you say to law enforcement can be used against you, and it can be used against everybody else too. When police are doing investigations into political communities, they're not just investigating sort of one discrete incident or one discrete crime. They're collecting intelligence on the broader movement to see, who might be vulnerable to certain other tactics, who might be able to flip into being an informant for us. Who can we keep coming back to for information? A quick joke here. How do you tell when a cop is lying?
When their mouth is moving.
When their lips are moving, right? Everything a cop says, don't believe it. Cops are allowed to lie to you. They'll say, we have 8 surveillance videos that all show you breaking that window. Those surveillance videos don't exist. And if they had 8 surveillance videos showing it, then why the hell are they asking you questions? Just arrest you and take you to jail and use the surveillance videos. Why are they asking you a question? So, don't trust a cop. It's a bad idea. Non-cooperation with grand juries. I do a whole separate presentation on grand jury resistance sometimes, so we don't have time here, but somebody once told me that grand jury resistors are some of the most unsung heroes of our movement. That their refusal to cooperate in spite of sometimes really dramatic consequences are extremely valuable for maintaining solidarity, maintaining an ethic of non-cooperation. And one final thing on silence to law enforcement that came up at the Know Your Rights training yesterday. Sometimes it's really difficult to not talk. We're all socialized to want to be cooperative and friendly, especially with authority figures. Sometimes we're scared, sometimes we're caught off guard. Maybe they come to your house when you're in the shower or when you're asleep, and so you're like kind of dragging out of bed groggy, and you're like, ugh, and they're like, oh, hey, how's it going, blah, blah, blah. And so it's important to practice not cooperating, not talking. And so, get with your collectives, get with your community, your roommates, your parents, whoever the people that might be approached by law enforcement, and be like, can you, just over and over again say, I'm not going to answer any questions, I'm going to remain silent. I'm not going to answer any questions, I'm going to remain silent. When the cops are doing the good cop, bad cop thing, whatever tactic they're using, practice it with the people that you organize with, the people that you live with, socialize with, so that you're comfortable in that moment relying on your training and not having to think really deeply about oh, is this a good question to answer? Is this a bad question? I don't know what they're asking about. Just, I'm not going to answer any questions. I'm going to remain silent.
So the next S is security culture. And generally, I'm pretty skeptical about how security culture is used, because oftentimes it's used as just kind of like a bulletproof vest against repression, and also, which is not true, and it is not a bulletproof vest. And also, oftentimes in a North American context, it has a highly technical sort of usage. Like if you use the right encryption software on your phone, or don't talk about this or do that, then somehow you get away from repression. And really, we'd like to kind of rethink that, and that repression will always exist, and security culture is part of a larger strategy that's needed. It's alone security culture is not a guarantee of anything. That said, it is useful in especially contexts of movements that have above ground and below ground activities going on. So broadly, security culture is the